Vikas Saini is the president of the Lown Institute. He is a cardiologist. He has been in clinical practice for 20 years. He has been an entrepreneur, founding a company working with the technology to monitor conscious patients in the OR. And for several years, he has run a global network, a health primary care network. So he has a large experience, and since I guess since 2007 he has been at the Lown Institute. So welcome, Vikas.
Thank you, Rolf. It's truly a pleasure to be here. I was delighted to get the invitation. It's been a long-standing wish of mine to be above the Arctic Circle and to visit this country. As I was saying last night at dinner, I hope to buy real estate here because in another 50 years, this is going to be one of the busiest places on the planet. I'm not sure you wanted to hear that. So I want to change gears a little bit and talk in a more philosophical way. And I hope this provokes you to thinking, perhaps it challenges you. Certainly it is unformed. It's part of what I've been thinking about for a while. And I'm hoping with the help of all of you, we'll get clearer ideas for the issues we face and how we're going to solve them. I think that the simple message that I want to convey today is that life itself is actually a terminal condition.
You mentioned on the phone that you've had some dizziness.
Yes, a little dizziness, and I think I'm developing a hearing loss in my right ear. Or my left ear. No, I'm sorry, it's my right or my left ear. Now I can't remember.
Okay, let's take a look. Sorry to say you have had a significant drop in the high decibel range of your right ear.
Really?
You've been exposed to a loud noise recently? You had a virus?
No, I've been perfectly healthy. You know me, I always imagine that I have things.
When did you first notice this?
Well, about a month ago. What do I have?
You've had some dizzy spells. What about ringing and buzzing? You notice any of that?
Yes, now that you mention it, I have buzzing and also ringing and buzzing. Am I going deaf or something?
And it's just in one ear.
Yes, is it healthier to have problems in both ears?
Hey, what's the matter with you? You're all right.
I feel dizzy. You know, I don't feel well. Do you hear a ringing? Is there a ringing sound?
Yeah, I hear it.
I don't like that.
Yeah, we're going to be working late tonight. No water out, it's all right, yeah.
If I have a brain tumor, I don't know what I'm going to do.
You don't have a brain tumor. He didn't say you had a brain tumor.
No, naturally, they're not going to tell you because, well, you know, sometimes the weaker ones will panic if you tell them.
But not you.
Oh, God. You're a buzzing. Is there a buzzing?
Mickey, come on, we got a show to do.
I can't keep my mind on the show.
But there's nothing wrong with you.
If there's nothing wrong with me, then why does he want me to come back for tests?
He has to rule out certain things.
Like what?
I don't know, cancer.
Don't say that. Don't mention that while I'm in the building.
But you don't have any symptoms?
I got the classic symptoms of a brain tumor. I'm dying. I know it. There's a spot on my lungs. Now, take it easy with you. It's not on your lungs. It's on your ear. It's the same thing, isn't it? I can't sleep. Oh, God, there's a tumor in my head the size of a basketball. Now I keep thinking I can feel it every time I blink. Oh, Jesus. He wants me to do a brain scan to confirm what he already suspects. Look, I'll make a deal with God. Let it just be my ear, okay? I'll go deaf. I'm blind in one eye, maybe. But I don't want a brain operation.
So, almost a perfect depiction of what happens on a daily basis in many clinics and at home. So, we're all going to die. As far as we know, we're the only species that is aware of that fact. And I suspect that that has a lot to do with how we react when we become ill. I think it's really one of the deepest mysteries we face. We don't quite know what it means, but it's very poignant. And I think we need magic and we need ritual. And we need these things in order to keep that awareness from flooding in on a daily basis. It allows us to get our work done every day. And it may even be that there was a Darwinian selection process that allows us to do this and get on with our day. You might say that we must think magically. It's almost in our DNA. So, as we heard from Shannon, there are really a myriad of drivers of overuse. Slavish devotion to technology, lack of evidence, fear of uncertainty, certainly an inability to share decision-making, poor communication, patient demand. I mean, these are all things that I think we know and are aware of. But I want to suggest that really it is this issue of fear of mortality that creeps in with the slightest sniffle on the nose or a little sore throat. And I see this, I've seen this in patients when they're 90, because when they're 90, the next thing could be the last illness. You don't really see it in people in their 20s, but I suspect somewhere we have this worry, and it's always there. Well, the earliest practitioners of medicine, were shamans, and this is a picture of a shaman that was described by the earliest European who was a Dutchman who was traveling, and he gave this rendition in the first published work in the 17th century. So anthropologists theorized that shamanism was a magic practice to ensure a successful hunt or the gathering of food. Undoubtedly, it's very ancient, probably the Paleolithic, long before we invented agriculture. And I think it speaks to a deep need we have for magic. So the question I have really is, do we still? Well, certain parts of the world we do. This is a drum. It's probably from a region near here, if not right here. I don't know, but I'm sure you do. But here's the tarot card for the magician. And really, fundamentally, what we know is that the shaman or the magician is the mediator between ourselves and the spirit world. And medicine evolved in that way initially. And I think, as we saw in the Woody Allen film and elsewhere, even the most trivial condition evokes this. And so today, the question is what role is there for that belief or that need or perhaps that problem? Well, Abraham Flexner, who was an American, was asked by Carnegie initially and then the Rockefellers and others to look at American medicine. And he issued a report, and we call it the Flexion Report. It was written in 1910. And what he said was there's too much magic, there's too much charlatanism, too much snake oil, and we have to get rid of it. We have to be scientific. We need the scientific method. We need rigor, all of which was true and remains true. But there were some consequences of the Flexner Report. Many schools of medicine were closed, including those that were historically African American, those that had predominance of women. And in general, as the scientific medicine movement took off, the alliance with corporate interests and new forms of research, new types of technologies became stronger and stronger. And the Flexion Report, I think, set the stage for the next 100 years, and we're now at the end of that 100-year phase. And the question is that still relevant, or how might we need to change it? So there's some really interesting work. There's a great paper I found. It's referenced at the bottom there, and I'm going to quote from it. But really, we see amazing results from sham operations. When we do randomized clinical trials, for instance, of certain types of knee surgery, some of you may know, the results of the operation are not that much better than sham. And the question is why? And these authors pointed out that there's a placebo value of ritual. A modern operation starts with a series of events used by shamans. It includes journeying to a healing place, fasting, wearing ritual garb, having a special mask, using psychotropic substances. And then the final central activity, which is often dramatic, may involve some violation of the body, and then post-ritual healing. And so these authors said that any research on the effectiveness of surgical procedures, especially those designed to relieve pain, needs to be aware of the strong suggestive effect of elaborate rituals in what we do. So this is my mentor, Dr. Bernard Lown, and I don't think I've ever said this, and I'm glad he's not here to hear it, but boy, he's a shaman if ever there was one. After around 1977, he began to feel quite disturbed by the rapid rise of coronary artery bypass surgery. And in large measure, it was not that he was a stranger to technology. He had helped develop the DC defibrillator. He had built one of the first coronary care units in the United States, certainly in Boston. But in his clinical experience and that of his mentor, the great cardiologist Dr. Samuel Levine, coronary patients actually did quite well in the main. And he was fond of telling all his fellows, including me, that coronary disease is a benign condition. Now, we thought that was quite a dramatic statement. In the main, I think he was right. So he began to avoid catheterization. He began to treat with medical management very intensively, but in particular he paid close attention to the psychologic needs of patients, to the social stressors, the family factors, and in that process developed an alternative model for care for coronary disease, so much so that people began coming from all over the world for second opinions. And I think it's, whether this was placebo or not, we can debate, but it speaks to the value of a relationship and a certain style of care for achieving results. So I recently reviewed those results, and I think this is some of the longest follow-up that we have and that's been reported. So 12-year follow-up, and at 12 years in an aging population, I think this is a pretty good all-cause mortality rate. This is annualized with a median survival time. And quite similar to the surgical medical arms, either one, since they were equivalent of Barry 2D or Courage, two trials that compared a mechanical revascularization approach to medical management. So when the coronary artery surgery study was published about 2 years after our initial reports, these were the findings. And if you can't see a difference, that's because there is none between the medical and surgical arms. And in each case, and this is now 10 years out, in the main, there were subgroups where surgery was better, but in the main, there was no difference. So that was not a surprise to us, but I think what's more interesting for all of us as we think about medicine and how we organize care and what the problems are is the lag time between evidence like this and the actual adoption of the procedure. The first surgery was done in 1960, May 2nd, 1960. The first vein graft was in 67, the first Lima in 68. This trial, the first results were not published till 1981 or thereabouts. And it's interesting because the investigators in that paper said the marked relief of angina and the belief of many physicians that the procedure may reduce long-term mortality have resulted in a rapid increase in the number of procedures. Nor were we surprised by the results of the Courage trial, which came out in 2007. And in this case, each of these panels represents a different type of outcome. On the upper left is composite, then there's one for MI, one for cardiac mortality, and in each of these, I think that the results were not a surprise, but it raises these interesting questions, which is, when we value science the way Abraham Flexner wanted us to value science, we don't really ask, what is happening on the placebo side of that gold standard. And a lot of interesting things are happening on the placebo side. And I think there are interesting things that we may be able to mobilize systematically as we begin to develop a new way of thinking about care. So I think the experience that we had at Lown, that others have had around the world, that too often the prescription or the procedure becomes the only way that we clinicians know how to be with our patients. And in fact, if we have time and take time with patients and get to know them, we may in fact be very effective as healers, and in that way achieve results that are more efficient both from a money point of view and in the long run even from a time point of view than we might imagine. And in economics, I think there's a needed rethink about the concept of efficiency. So that's a long dissertation that I won't get into here. But there's no question that for certain types of interactions, the most efficient is to spend more time, not less time. And I think healthcare and medicine in particular is one of them. So, Shannon talked a little bit about the different drivers, and I think there are definitely technical ones. There's an over-reliance on pathophysiologic reasoning or anatomical reasoning, over-reliance on surrogate outcomes, many of which sound right but end up not to be right in the real world of complexity, both of physiologic complexity and the social complexity that we all live in. There's clearly a pro-intervention bias, especially amongst younger clinicians, I think. Those of us who've seen the harms after many years know that that decision is always a fateful decision, and it seems like it's the right decision, but one isn't always sure, and it adds a layer of caution, I think, for older physicians. Clinical practice guidelines. Sadly, I don't think we can simply rely on them. It turns out that many of them are not based on the kind of gold standards of evidence we would all like to see. They're expert consensus opinion, often with conflicted parties helping to write them. And yet, what I'm saying is not new. I think many people know about this. Many people have thought about this. And, there are various proposals for solutions. And what I will call a sort of Flexnerian one is, evidence-based medicine. We need evidence-based medicine. As I like to say, it's like what a Western journalist asked Gandhi one time, what do you think of Western civilization? And Gandhi reportedly said, I think it would be a good idea. And so in the case of evidence-based medicine, randomized trials aren't always available, and I think even more importantly, there's the problem of the dark matter. That's the trials that don't get done, that don't get funded, that there's no vested interest to do the trial, and yet the results might well be actually very important to how we manage things. It presumes that the RCTs are actually replicable and unbiased, and I'm not sure we can say that with confidence every time. And it presumes that the results of evidence are actually translated into practice. Or, to put it a different way, that the mere publishing of a paper and the dissemination in the profession is enough to translate into practice. And all of those things, I think, are problematic, and sometimes they're problematic for intrinsic reasons, human nature. Sometimes they're about interests, competing interests, vested interests. And it's about who generates the evidence. So part of what I think we face is this idea, as Shannon called silver bullets, the idea that there's a penicillin that you can take, and it takes care of this one molecular problem and creates a cure. And we all know that is extremely simplistic. But that is one of the consequences of a reductionist scientific framework in which we keep searching for the individual molecular patterns, and we forget that improved detection or some other marker or technique is not the same as improved health. And all of us, I think, are aware of this in various fields. In my own field, the troponin leak. You know, the number of times you see residents treating a troponin leak as if it's the same as a non-QAMI, or pulmonary embolism, where the resolution of the technology has reached a stage where you can detect things. The question is, should you call them a pulmonary embolism? Or is it just a clot that we all have and walk around with every day and then it dissolves? We don't know the natural history. We don't know for sure if it's the same illness. And yet we name it the same, and then quite often it creates a cascade of effects. So, you know, what I'm saying is not new. My colleagues wrote a paper in The Lancet looking at the legacy of Flexner, and it was led by Dean Julio Frank. There were others, well-known people in public health, who wrote it up, and they pointed out all these problems worldwide, including the security of healthcare itself being threatened, inequities rising, rapid demographic shifts, health systems struggling, becoming more complex and costly, all of which I'm sure you are aware of. Poor teamwork, which is a major theme in efforts at reform in the United States today. Episodic encounters instead of continuous care, a hospital orientation instead of primary care, tribalism of the profession. So they laid out all of these things. And now it's clear that we have a lot of complexity, and we have a complex system. In the United States, the Republicans at least think that this is what it looks like. And I'm not sure they're wrong. It is a very complex system. And I think we may have reached our limits a little bit, limits on how we're going to understand things if we keep breaking them down into smaller and smaller bits. Understanding how the whole system behaves is more of a challenge. And so the idea of science and how we think of science, I think, is really up for grabs. Technologic fetishism, conflicts of interest, fragmentation, all of those lead us to need, I think, a new paradigm. And yet, I think we all still crave a certain amount of magic. It's just that it's bad magic. I think part of what's happened is that technology feels like it's going to solve these problems, and it's not. Another consequence that Shannon mentioned that I think many of you will react to is that health professionals worldwide are feeling this. I was astonished at our last meeting that the Lown Institute convened in December. We had people from 12 countries, 13 countries, and we thought we'll talk about the regional differences, but what was instead the theme was the commonality of this feeling that things have become too transactional and not enough relational. And some core piece of meaning and relationship has been lost. fancy advertisement for a clock, a watch. But it illustrates a certain way of thinking, and the question is the human body that? Are people that way? You know, is that what we really are? And I think we would all agree that's not true, but we're struggling to think in a different way about how it might be different.
Have you ever wondered how thousands of birds move in amazing patterns like this? Ever watched fish schooling and wondered how they coordinate their movements? When you're looking at a flock of birds or a school of fish, you're watching the behavior of a system of many interacting parts. In this case, individual birds or individual fish are the parts. Systems where unexpected patterns emerge as a result of many individual parts interacting are called complex systems. The study of complex systems has recently been recognized as a new type of science.
Are inappropriate for what you want to describe that is out there. And you need to go out of the box, you have to create a new paradigm, new perspective, you need a paradigm shift.
So people are beginning to recognize this. I'm certainly not an expert in some of the details of what is these days being called network theory or network medicine. But I do know enough to understand that there are new ways of thinking and new paths that we need to take. And it got me wondering whether there aren't really quite simple forms of understanding of these large complex systems. And mathematicians have begun to recognize that there are simple, what they call sort of universal laws. When computation becomes really difficult because there's so many moving parts and interaction, it turns out that they call this the curse of dimensionality, but it turns out that when they become large enough, you can find fairly simple, very interesting and helpful universal laws. And quite a few of these have been described, and we know one of these in medicine actually quite well. We just know it. We haven't perhaps thought of it in that way. And that's the normal distribution. You know, when you really think about it, we use it all the time, but the normal distribution, the central limit theorem basically states that, you know, with the repeated sampling and repeated iteration, you know, your estimate of the mean is going to converge. And it turns out that that is true whether or not the population distribution initially is normal or not. But even more importantly, it seems to be true for all sorts of different phenomena that seem unrelated. Things like height, weight, the incidence of accidents, you know, profits in corporations, particles in a physical system. And so that distribution is a simple universal arising out of a very complex set of interactions. Here's one that's not as familiar, called Zipf's law. And it's mostly just interesting to me, but I think it points a direction for us. Zipf was an English linguist, and he noticed that if you rank order the frequency of words in English, the commonest word is the. And the second commonest is of. And it turns out that the ratio of those two is half. And the third is and the ratio of that is a third. And as you go down the rank, it is 1/n. It's just quite remarkable, and nothing obvious that we know of in language would suggest that this would be the truth, and yet it appears to be true. And what's really interesting is that that's also true in other things. So this is world city populations. Why the hell this is true, I don't know. but it follows Zipf's law. And there are others like that. You know, the number of people watching a TV channel, sizes of corporations, various things. So in the field of complexity, there are some interesting universals that are emerging, and I use that more to get us all thinking in our own areas. What is missing and what might we find? Because we need to start searching. We need to start searching for some of the simpler rules that will help us understand the biology, the physical complexity, but of us as human beings, really, as whole human beings. And we know that we're more than an aggregate of our physiologic markers. You know, my blood pressure, my cholesterol, sugar, this and that. We're many, many things, more than that. And we know that targeting a specific biomarker for reduction, like blood pressure, can lead to error. And I think part of what happens when overtreatment happens is we have this framework for thinking that is fundamentally incorrect. So in this example, I think many of you will be aware, but where's the pointer? So, you know, this is a normal distribution of blood pressure, and we typically in medicine treat the tail of the distribution. We define a cutoff point at which treatment is beneficial. Let's say it's 160 over 95, you know, pick a number. And we know that the folks here without treatment are at very high risk. That means many of them, as a proportion of the total, will get a stroke or a heart attack. If we treat them, we know that we can reduce the incidence of stroke and heart attack. All of that is correct. On the other hand, when you look at the normal distribution, and the epidemiologist Jeffrey Rose made this point many years ago, most people are in here. They have a normal blood pressure, and most heart attacks and strokes are going to happen here. And so the medical way of thinking would be to say, oh, well, then we better put all these people on medicine. But there's some problem with the math, and the problem is that the side effect of the treatment is sort of a fixed. And for the same reason that most of the people are here, a low rate of harm, as Shannon pointed out, a very low rate of harm applied to a large population will lead to very large numbers of side effects and far fewer benefits. And so this is one way in which overtreatment happens, thinking about us as individual particles of this cholesterol or this blood pressure. But it's actually even, I think, more interesting if we start looking a little bit further, because we know that there are other approaches. So we know that society-wide efforts can move the whole mean of the distribution. And even if you move the mean a little bit, you get a massive improvement in avoidance of strokes and heart attacks. That's typically a public health measure, like salt reduction. That was done in Japan. In northern Japan in the 1960s, there was about an 80% reduction in the incidence of strokes, fatal strokes. The UK is currently embarked on a national program to reduce salt intake through working with food manufacturers. And those kinds of measures do have an impact, very different from a medicalized model. So we're not helpless, and I think if that weren't complex enough, it's even more complicated. Because this axis is that bell-shaped curve I showed you of the blood pressure distribution across the population. But for any given blood pressure, for any given cholesterol, for any given aortic valve area, for any given anything, the patient has a point of view as well. And so there's also a variation on this other axis, which is the patient's own view of risk and what is acceptable to the patient. And, you know, fundamentally, that cannot be dismissed. It's equally valid. It's more valid. Because at the end of the day, if you explain everything to the patient, you know, you have a valve area of 0.5 and your mortality without a valve replacement is that. At the end of the day, if the patient really understands all that, and they say, I don't want it, what are you going to do? Arrest them? So we know about shared decision making. This is just a screenshot of one computerized version of shared decision making. And I think the interesting take-home here is the point that Shannon has already made, that when shared decision making is deployed, we see a systematic reduction in the choice for more invasive procedures. So for early prostate cancer, 50% more likely to choose watchful waiting. For stable coronary disease, 20% less likely to choose the intervention. For hip and knee arthritis, 20 to 25%. So we do have some idea from randomized trials of shared decision making how much unwanted care may be just built into the system. And I think nothing is better proof of a generalized systematic bias towards a little more than really people want, our populations want, than this data stream. And the interesting thing to me, the really interesting thing, is that this is not just true in the United States with its famously aggressive medical system, at least for those who have the money. Because this is a study out of Dartmouth, and the question is, who decides the right rate? Each one of these red dots represents a hospital area in the United States. And on the left axis is the rate per thousand of invasive cardiac procedures. That includes stents and surgeries, I believe. Although I think the study was done before stents, so it may just be plain old balloon angioplasty. But you see that, not surprisingly, the U.S. has a lot of variation. We don't know who's up here. But the Ontario benchmark is here, and the propaganda in the United States, I'm Canadian, by the way, that's my one disclosure. The propaganda in the United States is that there are long waiting lines in Canada, and they all flock across the border to come and get their stent, and it's just not true. But we do know that there are less in the U.S. This was in Toronto, less than in the U.S. So the question is, given shared decision-making, would they choose more? Is it just a systemic problem? And the answer is, after shared decision-making, they choose even less, 20% less. So even in Canada, there's something going on here. So that issue of how we think about the problem and how we frame the problem, defining whether or not we can find solutions, I think is important. And as I said earlier, the issue of complexity theory that I find intriguing is that there may be some simpler ways of thinking that capture the complexity we face. I don't pretend to have those answers, but I'm saying that may be the path we have to go. And here's another version. One of the big problems that's confronting us all, and I know it's confronting you here, is the question of scale, the question of size. What's the right size for hospitals? What's the right size for clinics? What's the right size for patient panels? Well, I don't know, but here's something interesting. There is a chap named Robin Dunbar. Anybody heard of the Dunbar number? Okay. So Robin Dunbar is a sort of paleo-archaeologist or anthropologist. And what he did was he calculated across a number of primate species neocortical size and social network, size of social network, and found a fairly linear relationship. And when he extrapolated that for human beings and human neocortical size, he came up with a number called the Dunbar number. And that number seems to be the number of people that we can keep in a stable social relationship in a way that we actually know them, that they represent, roughly speaking, the community that we can keep in mind and know. And that, I think, is a fascinating theory. What is that number? Well, the number, it turns out, is about 150. That's his number. Other anthropologists have come up with other numbers, but they're in that order of magnitude, maybe 200, maybe 250. And I'm told, according to Wikipedia, the Swedish tax authorities decided to reorganize some of their offices to sort of meet this. And I've heard of other enterprises like factories that claim that their efficiency seems to drop down when they go past that number, so they like to keep their production units and their teams in this size. It's plausible. I think it's certainly interesting. And so the question is, are there simple rules across even larger networks? You know, are there human universals? So there are people who've looked at that, and you know, much of this is not particularly shocking or surprising, but it's important, I think, because there's simple moral rules. The golden rule. It appears to be true in every society that we know of or have looked at. Some sense of reciprocity, that we are wired. We are social beings deep down, and we're wired for this. So, I don't know what all this means, but I know that these are some of the things that have to inform us as we think about transforming our healthcare systems. We know it's going to take altered incentives. We know it takes data collection. It takes data mining, analytics, lots of things that are happening. We know for sure it's going to need a change in education and in training. Probably some version of an understanding of our own resource utilization as we make decisions. Though I must confess, I don't like that way of thinking. When I'm in the exam room with the patient, I don't really care what the budget is. It's what that patient needs at that moment. We have to design systems that allow for that and still get the right care. And finally, I think we really need to restore medicine as a calling. So that's really what I have to share with you. It's difficult, it's complicated, there's a lot of experimenting to do. I think the change we seek is fundamental. It's really about how we're going to live in the modern world. Planetary boundaries are real, and we all need to figure out how we're going to survive. So we have to find other ways of thinking, other ways of doing. We have to organize ourselves and our institutions, and really our society as a whole, to be faithful to that ancient heritage that we have, but also true to the technological genius that we also clearly have. In medicine, the delivery of health care needs to be faithful to all of that. I think we need small patient panels, patients whom we really have time to know. We need small neighborhood clinics. We need to be comfortable with our own mortality. We need to acknowledge that everything we do in every possible way has to do as much as possible for the patient and as little as possible to the patient. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vikas. It was a philosophic view on the theme, and yeah, it's fit well in. So thanks a lot. So, do any of you have a question for Vikas? Anyone with a master in philosophy here? Comments? Anyway, thanks a lot. Here is a present from Tromsø to remind you of this meeting.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay.